Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Theresa Carilli. Dr. Carilli has a PhD from Southern Illinois University in Performance Studies. She is a media scholar and playwright. She's currently editing a book series for Rowman and Littlefield Lexington Press on media culture and the arts. Welcome, Theresa.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Good to have you. I thought we might get started by talking about why it matters what gets portrayed in the media and how it gets portrayed. I mean, that's sort of an assumption that we all have, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, the media, the media has a huge responsibility to the public to make sure that it correctly and accurately and informatively represents them. So in my mind, it's one of the most important the important genres of our time, if you will, and most important venues of our time, you know.
And this is because it sort of has an effect of hegemony. It creates culture. It perpetuates culture. I mean.
Oh, absolutely. And just I'm more aware of pictures than anything else nowadays, and what they're conveying to us, because in this time of sound bites, what we do is we go right to the picture, and the picture tells us, we're less inclined, and as we know, newspapers are getting smaller and smaller, and it's just a very interesting so what happens when we see a picture, and what does it tell us about a culture? And then we being human beings go right towards the stereotypes, and so it gets a little bit it gets a little tough and complicated.
Yeah. So a television producer, let's say, doing a show like 24. I don't know if you've ever seen this.
Oh yeah. In fact, I knew somebody who was acting in that show.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah.
I'm kind of a 24 junkie. I watch them all when they come out on DVD, in a couple of days. But I don't necessarily agree with their politics, but I like the excitement of it. So the broadcaster, the producer, the actors, the script writers, they have a responsibility to not portray.
This is really, this is a really complicated issue.
It is, yes,
because it's also, it's not just who they're portraying and who they're representing, but sometimes there's that other part of this, which is what is entertainment. Right. And sometimes there's a two-sided issue here. One is we really want to just entertain people. Sometimes, I will absolutely admit that last night I watched a Lifetime movie, and this is one of the has some of the most horrid depictions of women, etc. But sometimes you just don't want to be thinking, and so you have that side. But then at the same time, you have that other side if you do want to be seeing very authentic portrayals and representations of people, and that's very, 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 very important. So it's sort of there's colliding worlds in a sense,
Well, so both of us had English degrees somewhere along the line.
Yes,
right?
indeed.
So if we think of this in terms of literature, the point isn't then that things should be policed and there should be no aberrant portrayals of people or culture or groups, but the issue is more the overall. The accumulation of these portrayals. I'm just
what the issue becomes is counterbalancing images.
Okay.
So what happens is if you have a really negative depiction of a group, for example. I'm trying to think of a group that's not often represented, And we can talk about gays and lesbians in the media. Right. For example, for years there were no depictions, and the depictions that were there were very negative. Right. And usually they were films, and the gay person was killed at the end of the film. Oh yeah. There's just a history of that.
That's
starting with the 1960s Children's Hour. She commits suicide at the end of the play. Movie. They're all and then we see current like a Brokeback Mountain or it just seems like even there was one with I can't, the actor's name escapes me right now.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's one of the things that was kind of constantly happening is that the gay person, the gay person was killed. So what happens is that if you don't see enough counterbalancing images of, you know, some boring gay people going through their boring day-to-day life,
Yeah.
this is all you think,
Dying
that
in
they're
their
just,
sleep instead of-
exactly, that they have these dramatic
Right.
lives and they're just, you
Yeah.
know, and in reality, most of our lives are really, really, you know, sort of, you know,
Yeah.
steady. But let me just say, let me comment this to you, because I
Yeah.
know this about you, because you're a
Yeah.
news guy,
Yeah.
which is that, you know, you are supposed to be telling the world what's newsworthy. And that's really, that issue of what is newsworthy becomes a very, very critical issue in these times.
It does. It does. You know, when this comes up, I think about when I was editor of a small suburban paper, and we published the police reports. We turned them into little paragraph stories. And I got a phone call one morning. This person had, you know, gotten inebriated over the weekend, brought somebody home from a bar, got into a fight in the house. It spilled into the yard. The neighbors told them to be quiet. They weren't quiet. The police came. They fought with the police. They got arrested. And I got a call the next morning, don't print that story. It'll ruin my life.
Oh, yeah, that's tough.
And, you know, my feeling was, you know, as, you know, this is a small media role here, but my feeling was that in this case, this medium that I was in charge of, this little newspaper, wasn't really responsible for deciding what police reports to print, to print and what not to print. That if it happened and it got into a police report, I was going to print it. Now, in my mind at that time, I was probably 24 years old or 26 years old. I thought I was being objective and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But even then, I suppose, right? I mean, I was deciding what was news. I could have said, okay, well, we're not going to print certain types of police reports anymore, right?
Yeah,
And if I'm CBS
Right,
or ABC or
right.
NBC, I could say, well, we're not going to have two shows this season that are both
Right.
depicting Arabs as, you know, terrorists or something, right?
Right.
And
right.
that's kind of the responsibility you're expecting to see here, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but
right?
but at the same time, the other side of the media is that, but this sells. This is what people want to know. But we're not seeing, you know. But the thing is that we need to have something that, again, the counterbalancing images. So as long as there are the counterbalancing images, and usually there's a preponderance of negative stereotypes, particularly of a marginalized group or a particular, you know, ethnicity, and that's one of the hardest things, you know. In fact, when I taught ethnicity in film, I always would, you know, really focus on that, is that we'd see, you know, just these singular depictions of you know, ethnic groups in the media, and then our whole construction of this ethnic group was based on that very, you know, that very depiction.
So, since you're also a playwright, I just thought it might be interesting to explore the author's role in this. And I know you've written about the portrayal of Italian Americans in film. And I remember we first talked about this before some of the worst the worst examples we could cite were actually put out. But we were
Tony and Tina's wedding, which let's go back to.
But let's say you're writing a play.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you avoid putting an Italian character in there who's a gangster?
This is a hard question, and here's the thing: is I'm trying to think if I have ever written a gangster. Probably, you know, the issue is that when you write plays, and when you work with any kind of creative medium, you want to be honest, and you want to give authentic depictions. So it's not whether you're presenting a gangster, it's are you giving some depth and insight into the gangster, so that we can see him as an individual. Him, you know, as an individual. I'm saying him. I'm thinking, there are not a lot of female gangsters out there.
Right. Equal rights amongst gangsters, though, you know, if they
But
want.
I will share with you that I had a couple of heartaches with my plays, because the earliest plays that I wrote about Italian Americans, you know, I'd get these calls saying, we want to produce your work, and then there'd be the follow-up call, which is, we think there's too much of a stereotype, and I'd bristle. They tell me this, and I'd say, but that's not what I'm going for. I'm going to give you some kind of an understanding of who these people are, and that would just be that would be tough.
So, for example,
Let me see. Okay, first off, communication style being very, you know, expressive and emotional, and then this whole idea of this you know, that there's almost a melodrama and a sense of, you know, the women are portrayed a certain way, the men are portrayed a certain way, because there is really a split in the culture.
Yeah.
At least the
You're talking
culture I grew up
Italian
of Italian Americans.
portrait.
There really was a split. The men, you know, had a different set of values, and the women, you know, they have what's called in Italian culture mother-centered, father-dominated, where the women all work to make sure that the rules are that the father enforces the rules, and you know, and stuff. So I don't know. That was kind of what happened.
Well, so were you tempted to change your script or your
you
story?
know, this is the problem with me is that and I will give anybody advice that if you get a chance to be produced, you know, and always change your script. I had a huge fight with somebody.
I'm hearing things I wasn't expecting today. This is going to be a difficult interview. I don't know where I'm going to go next.
If you have, and I know, it's very interesting, because if you feel you feel that your work is honest, stay by it.
Yeah.
But you know, it's really sometimes very tough, because you want to be fair, you want to be honest, you want to tell a good story, and that's the bottom line, you know. And so.
Well, and do you think sometimes those stereotypes are correct? Are there certain
There is
stereotypes
truth
that
in
have...
stereotypes. There is always some truth. There's always a grain of truth. But when we don't, for example, let's say, you know, you've never met an Italian American from the East Coast, which I am, and I can certainly, you know, do the stereotype, and happy to do the stereotype. But and your sense is that you're going to be expecting somebody from, you know, one of the various shows or movies that you've seen. You're expecting a certain kind of Italian American. You're not expecting an educated, knowledgeable, to be expressing theory or you know, anything of the sort. That's what it comes down to.
Well, and I suppose if you portrayed something that was too far from the stereotype, it might look inauthentic, right? Unless you're really working it to make that point.
Well, the thing is that, I mean, sometimes it's what's interesting to me, and what I love to read is the subtleties of character, where there is an ethnicity inscribed into the character, but you're not really, you know, quite aware of that. But you kind of, you're from the stereotypes in your head. Now, I just was thinking about one thing while we were talking, which is my big fat Greek wedding.
Oh, now it's back on me.
Yeah, it's back on you, because it's sort of like, so what? I mean, this is the one depiction we have out there of Greeks, the Greek family.
Yes, we'll come back to this point. Thank you.
Okay.
We're going to take a quick commercial break. The Calumet Roundtable will be right back.
Okay.
What does it mean to get a graduate degree from Purdue University Calumet?
Purdue Calumet's graduate program really caters to the working professional. Most of the students in my cohort are already working out in the field in education, and we can go to work in the day and school at night.
I chose to go to Purdue University for graduate school because it's a great university that's close to home.
Purdue Calumet offers conveniences for all student types, location, flexible hours, day and night classes, and small class size. Purdue University, locally.
Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. My guest today is Dr. Theresa Carilli, and we're continuing our discussion on the media portrayal of different cultures and other issues, which we'll get to. But you just asked me before the break about my reaction to my big fat Greek wedding. Theresa is of Italian descent. I'm of Greek descent. And so she was turning the tables on me here. I enjoyed the movie, but I was bothered by it because that wasn't my experience growing up in a Greek community. That was, there was something different, and it did bother me a little bit that people who didn't know better, maybe thought that all Greeks are like this,
Well, what bothered you specifically? And this is an interesting and key issue too.
Well, I had a lot of respect for my grandfather and grandmother's generation. And so what I know about them is just steeped in this dignity that they created for themselves when they came over here, and they're, starting a business, my grandfather learning English and reading the Encyclopedia Britannica from front to back. He it was a pillar of the community. He had the first supermarket in Joliet, and he fed people during the Depression. All my life I've met people who said, I've been told about Tom Calameris and what he did for the community. So, I just didn't think of Greeks as funny, cute little people that went around spraying people with Windex and running through the backyards in their black robes and stuff. It was a little bit disturbing for me, I have to tell you.
But there's another way to look at this too.
Yeah.
And there's just two things that come up in that particular movie. One of them is that there's this sense of love and family and commitment and connection that's really nice.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the movie makes fun of white culture, which which is one of the first movies that really comes out there and just sort of really turns the camera around and puts it on this white family who are just dull. They're just dull.
They're stupid. They're dull, yes.
And so
they're fun.
And so for a moment there, we can just sort of laugh and be part of it. And that's one of the things is that I've always kind of thought, like with Italians, that there's some underlying jealousy that people have because they always look like they're very engaged in their lives. And that's one of the things about my big fat Greek weddings that people seem very engaged.
And that's true. That's a true stereotype of Greeks.
And I think it's almost like when you have that communal sense in a culture, I think that is for the vast majority of I want to say Americans, that's almost uncomfortable because it's something that they're not used to. It's sort of like, and do I have those values?
That's
I do.
a really good insight. I went to Mykonos, which is where my family's from, and I visited my great aunts there who were in their 80s. And when I wasn't visiting them, Mykonos is a big tourist attraction island. I was going to the clubs and hanging out with other tourists and stuff. And before I left, I went and sat down with my aunts again, and they knew every place that I had been, everybody had been talking to. And I couldn't believe it because it looked like these were two different worlds, right? But they were everybody's just so into everyone else's business. And I think that's sort of a Southern Mediterranean thing, though, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah. That's so interesting because I can't separate myself enough from it because I'm so involved in it. But it's very much a communal culture that you just really, and you can't dream of taking care of just yourself. The individualism as a value is not. It's collectivism. It's sort of like I have food. I'm gonna give it to you. I'm not going to eat it myself. I'm going to give it to you because that's how I think you and I were both raised with that kind of collective sensibility. And
we've both taken on responsibility for family members. Right?
That's right. And
something that we're very familiar with. But without getting too personal here, just to get back to it. So so that part of my big fat Greek wedding, I got. They did that well. And I think you even see that in the gangster movies. I mean, they're into one another's business, and there's a lot of compassion there. Right. But on the other hand, it was too shallow. And maybe you can't make a movie that's not shallow. But I think about, Zorba the Greek, which was the last big movie about Greeks, right? They had somebody who was Hispanic playing the Greek guy, right? And and it was all about dancing and stuff like that. And it wasn't. It didn't connect for me.
And yet that's an interesting, I actually wrote an article once about, I called it Italian-American performance style, where I talk about when we have these moments of somebody who plays an Italian, and like Cher, for example, even though she was married to an Italian at one point, she's in Moonstruck, she's, portraying.
She's not Italian?
Cher?
Yeah.
She's actually Lebanese and something.
You could have won a
something
big bet with me.
But she is,
I
you
was
know,
convinced.
but she really, you know, I thought she did a pretty good depiction, but there's something like when we look at like Marissa Tomei or Annabella Sciorra, that when they come to the table, they come as Italian Americans, and their performances are just, you see that the ethnic sensibility in everything they do, you know.
Well, that Moonstruck movie was not a real deep movie.
It was a pretty, you know, it was a good feel-good movie, you know, and stuff. Well, like my cousin Vinny is really just a great, you know, that's one of the classics.
Well, and
of all time.
that's a good example, isn't it? Right? In some ways.
But yet, at the same time, it took me years to get past this. But at the same time, Vinny, you know, uses his instincts to win the case.
Yes, he
and
does,
so there's something about that value of instinct that
yeah.
comes through there that I really love, you know. So, but I also, you know, again, when we have only these buffoonish looks of Italian, buffoonish, gangsterish, you know, stupid Italian, then we get very, very. You know, and I want to just mention to you that when I, you know, I've probably mentioned this to you before, but when I went to Sicily to visit my relatives for the first time, I was expecting, I had this, you know, sense of, oh, you know, everybody was going to be in black clothing and, you know, bring out their goats when I got there. And because I myself was, and it's actually somebody I know would call it the television Italian. That was my perception of what Italian
was. That scene in
was.
The Godfather where he goes back to Italy. Right?
And it wasn't like that. And then I found out that my great-grandfather was an architect, and I was just, you know, and they lived in this very, you know, this gorgeous, you know, palatial area, and these buildings that were just, and their sense of history. And they were just horrified by my lack of knowledge about geography and history. They were horrified because we're so insular in America. We aren't really taught, which is why, you know, we're having this kind of a conversation because it's.
And do you think that we first talked about this in the 80s, I think, right? Do you think that the image of Italian Americans is portrayed in film and through the media has changed over the years?
I'm always, you know, looking for a smart Italian American, you know, on TV. I'm looking for an educated one. I remember there was a show where they had an Italian American as a lawyer, but he was always very emotional. And so that was kind of, and I think that there have been a few, but there's always markers on Italians. And I think there are markers on ethnicities, whether or not somebody identifies themselves with that ethnicity. I wish I could give you specific examples, and they elude me right now, but we should pay attention to that a little more, you know. When we know that somebody is, I guess a good example might be like Jennifer Lopez. I'm thinking about her because she will always, she's Puerto Rican, and she will always bring a Latina sensibility to whatever it is she depicts, whatever role she's in, actually. So.
Just to shift just a little bit here, you were engaged in performance as critique, as scholarship sometimes, right?
Yes.
Can we talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
That's one of my favorite topics, and then I'll need another 2 hours for that.
Well, we'll do 2 minutes, but give us a quick explanation of what that involves.
It's just looking at, rather than looking at things through a traditional lens, looking at our scholarship through a traditional lens, we look at more of the narratives and stories that we tell one another, and how those narratives and stories serve as an understanding of communication. And so that's how I come to performance, because to me a good play, a good performance is a good story. And a good story tells us about life in a way that helps us to understand our own lives, helps us to reflect upon our own lives. And that's what I, you know, how I enter into the field of performance. And as a critique, to me, it turns back on itself, where you look at the nuances embedded in the story or in the narrative, or you perform that, and you yourself, when you're embodying that, are learning as well as hopefully teaching or educating your audience. And you know, my latest interest is in something called performative memoir, and what I'm really looking at now is I'm looking at the language of nostalgia. As I'm quite fascinated by how people express nostalgia, the kinds of language, the wording they will choose versus a traditional memoir, which will be maybe a little more descriptive. But with nostalgic memoir, the sentences tend to be short. I don't know if you know this piece, Moderato Cantabile. Do you know the piece? Okay, that goes. It's Marguerite Duras. It's just a beautiful, her work is very nostalgic. I'm looking at performance artists like Eve Ensler, who just had a recent memoir called In the Body of the World, where she really talks about her experience of having cancer in this way that takes you through her life. And nostalgia we always think of as positive, but sometimes nostalgia is negative. I mean, there can be, but there's this longing for this time where we learn something that transforms us, that changes us.
So as you're describing it, it sounds like we're thinking of the memoir. It's more of an investigation of the past, and the nostalgia is more of an essay on the past or something. It's more making something out of it. It's looking for
I'm looking at how we're using language differently, because when we're performing that nostalgia versus when we're telling the nostalgic story, versus I'm looking at how we're going to be how we're going to use language differently, and how it's going to take shape in a larger performance piece. So I do write performance pieces as well, which are these lengthy manuscripts about. I wrote one called Aftershocks, which was published with St. Martin's Press several years ago, and it's about. On one level, it's about my life living on the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West Coast, and but on another, it's about recognizing that I lost a whole generation of friends to AIDS, and that was really a painful time. And then I wrote a piece about my father called "Driving Without Brakes," because my father taught me to drive when I was 11 years old.
Okay.
And because I was tall, he had me out there driving. Anyways, so. Probably something, maybe not something I should admit on Calumet Roundtable.
I love that title. I think that's great.
Yeah, and so now I'm currently working on a piece called Loving Crazy, and that's about my sister.
Okay.
And stuff.
And I know you have a series of productions you've been doing at Calumet at the YG. Okay, well, thank you for being on the show
thank
today.
you, Dr. Roach. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Carilli. That is all the time we have on our program. Thank you for joining us on the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.